When we don't know what to do, Lord, we keep our eyes on you. You will lead us through the dark into the light. So we turn to you, dear Lord, and believing in your word, may we always keep our eyes on you. When a peril for the world seems to come crashing down, and there doesn't seem to be an ending in sight, all the news that we are hearing, so little hope is found, and the brightest day seems like the darkest night. When we don't know what to do, Lord, we keep our eyes on you. You will lead us through the dark into the light. So we turn to you, dear Lord, and believing in your word, may we always keep our eyes on you. When the trouble and the trial seems to spread everywhere, and the worry and the fear keep growing, it's true, we can turn to you, our Father, because we know you care, and your love and boundless grace will see us through. When we don't know what to do, Lord, we keep our eyes on you. You will lead us through the dark into the light. So we turn to you, dear Lord, and believing in your word, may we always keep our eyes on you. Hands are tough, but you have enough of the power to bring us through. We are not alone. You will lead us home if we place all our trust in you. When we don't know what to do, Lord, we keep our eyes on you. You will lead us through the dark into the light. So we turn to you, dear Lord, and believing in your word, may we always keep our eyes on you. Help us, Lord, to keep our eyes on you. Help us, Lord, to keep our eyes on you. On you. Yes, you. Only you. You're you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Don, for your beautiful solo. Those words remind us that to get through this pandemic, we have to do what I say all the time. We have to keep the sun in our eyes. We have to keep our eyes on God. Our faith in Him is the anchor that we can cling to in these turbulent times. Now, you all may have noticed that I'm standing just outside the elevator door on the middle stop at our campus, beside this quilt, this beautiful quilt that was a gift to Redland years ago by the women who work in Amani Yaju in Nairobi, Kenya. I thought of this place because it reminds me of one of Redland's own faith heroes, and you probably figured out I'm referring to Kathy Burke. And I thought of Kathy because, well, Kathy's a lot like the first person I want us to study as we begin a sermon series today on the faith heroes of the Bible that are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Of course, I'm referring to Abraham because, like Abe, Kathy followed God's call to a strange new land, Kenya, where she has faithfully served our Lord and the refugee women of Amani for, I guess, nearly 20 years now. I know this is going to embarrass Kathy to no end for us to spotlight her like that, but the fact is, Kathy Burke has the faith of Abraham. Not only has she been there working faithfully for these 2 decades now, when this pandemic struck a couple months ago, she could have flown home to the United States, but in faith, she and Mary Estelle have stayed and they continue to serve God there. We're thankful for the example that you set, Kathy, and Mary too. Okay, enough of embarrassing Kathy. Let's begin our study of Abraham. You remember that he was from Ur, the region of the world where the Tower of Babel was built. That means he grew up and lived in the pagan society that survived and thrived there about 4,000 years ago. Abraham was probably a well-educated, cultured man. And I say this because archaeologists have excavated Ur now, and they found it to have been a place where society was very advanced, much more advanced than historians originally thought. For example, they found a great library there with clay tablets that had the records of a thriving commerce, also all kinds of written literature, religion, and their definition. They dug up the foundations of huge structures, homes, palaces, public buildings that, well, they rival the kind we build today. I mean, Ur was a great place to live back then. I think of it as the Big Apple of the period. In fact, like New York, Ur was a port city. It was situated in that fertile crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. As I said, the people there were religious, but pagan, with priests who offered human sacrifices. And Abraham would have been very, very familiar with this part of the culture there because, according to Joshua, his father, whose name was Terah, was deeply involved in the religion of the area. The Mishnah also says that Terah, in fact, was a craftsman who made pagan idols for a living. Well, for some reason, God chose this well-educated, cultured, but pagan man to found his chosen people, the nation of Israel. One day, the Lord said to Abram, as he was known then, "Leave your country, leave your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a great blessing to all peoples on the earth, and all peoples will be blessed through you." That's Genesis 12, beginning with verse 1. Now think about this for a moment. Abram was from an idol-worshiping culture, and we know that idols can't talk, so when Abram heard God speaking to him, well, he knew something special was going on, something unprecedented, and he decided to obey this voice. Like Kathy, he left his culture with all its benefits, and he headed out to wherever God would lead him. This pagan man would never sleep under a roof again. No, for the rest of his long, long life, he would be known as a tent dweller. But the fact that Abraham was pagan isn't the only thing that makes us wonder why God chose him to be the father of his nation, chosen nation. You see, there was also Abraham's age and his wife Sarah's age. They were both, well, I hate to use the word because it kind of applies to me, they were old. He was 75 and she was more my age. She was 10 years his junior. Now, I know 75 is the new 40 these days, but Sarah was also infertile. She was barren. She was not able to have children. But still, Abraham obeyed. He left for who knows where, following the voice of God, who told him that in spite of his age and his wife's barrenness, he would be the father of a great nation. And this fact shows that Abraham was indeed a man of faith. In fact, Abraham's entire life is a story of faith. And perhaps for this reason, some say that with the exception of Jesus Christ, Abraham was the most important person in the Bible. If nothing else, the amount of space allotted in the Bible to tell his life story indicates his importance. I mean, 14 chapters are devoted to telling about Abraham. Plus, there are tons of other references to him throughout the scripture. And as I said, when you put it all together, when you read his entire story, it is indeed a story of faith. Let me put it this way. Moses was a great lawgiver. Joshua was a great military leader. David was Israel's most brilliant king. Elijah was their most influential prophet. Each of these men was great, but each of these men would have confessed in an instant that Abraham was his father in faith. In fact, Abraham's faith led him to being referred to as the friend of God 3 times. No one else is given that title. Paul goes so far as to refer to Abraham as the father of all who believe, all who have faith in God. Okay, what can Abraham's faith teach us about faith? What can we learn from him? What can he show us about walking by faith and not by sight, which is part of our vision for this year, remember? Well, first, Abraham shows us that faith is only as good as its object. Now, in spite of the fact that Abraham is repeatedly referred to as a model of faith, a close look at his story shows that, at least in the beginning, his faith was not all that impressive. I mean, in Genesis 12, God came to Abraham and told him to leave his home, and he did. But in the very next episode we read about in the Bible of Abraham's life, he and Sarah traveled to Egypt. And when they arrived, Abraham said something like this to Sarah: "Honey, you're a beautiful woman, and I know these Egyptian men. As soon as they lay eyes on you, someone will want to take you as his wife, and he will kill me in order to do so. So let's you and me lie. Let's tell them you're my sister, so they won't kill me. If one of them wants you, they can have you, but I'll be fine." Doesn't sound like a very nice husband, does he? And it doesn't sound like Abraham is very confident that God will protect him either, does it? Well, in Genesis 20, Abraham and Sarah do this same "she's my sister" lie thing again with another pagan ruler. Then, after 11 years of waiting for a child, Sarah says to Abraham, "Listen, husband, we've tried it God's way, but it's been a long time. Why don't you have a child with my servant girl, Hagar?" Well, did Abraham say, "No"? Did he say, "I will not do that, Sarah. We have to keep on trusting God"? No. Abraham agreed that this Hagar thing was a good idea. And like all times when you and I do things because we think we know better than God, it was a total disaster, one that the world still suffers from today. Then 13 years later, God tells Abraham that Sarah will bear him a child. Does Abraham say, "I believe you, God"? No, he fell on his face and laughed at God under his breath and said, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old?" And Sarah laughed too. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for me?" Well, does Abraham man up and admit that he laughed under his breath as well? No, he said nothing. So quick review here. Abraham's faith is so weak that he pretends Sarah is not his wife twice. His faith is so weak that he impregnates a servant girl, Hagar. His faith is so weak that he laughs at God. Yet centuries later, Paul says that Abraham's faith was such that he believed beyond all hope. Well, what's going on here? Why would Paul say that about this guy? Well, to answer our questions, we need to go back and try to enter Abraham's world. See, when Abraham first said yes to God, he was beginning literally from scratch. There was no Old Testament. There were no 10 Commandments. I mean, how many 10 Commandments did Abraham know? None, because there were none at the time. The story of Moses, Mount Sinai, the giving of the law, the consecration of the priest, the story of David and the Psalms and the sacrifices, none of this had occurred yet. He didn't know any of the stories about the Lord, Yahweh. He had zero information. He was the product of a brutal, superstitious, ancient culture, raised like everyone else in Ur, a pagan in a pagan world. So in Genesis 12:1, where we read earlier, that's Abraham's first interaction with the living, good, all-powerful, all-knowing, personal God, the one true God. God says to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, your father's household, to the land I will show you." And at this point, we see Abraham's faith, because Abraham got up and went, as the Lord had told him. Abraham is not presented in the Old Testament as a brilliant spiritual genius. No, he's just an average, ignorant, confused, superstitious, passive, and at times cowardly man. So why do we say his faith is so strong? Well, it's because at age 75, he had enough faith to obey God and leave Ur. Abraham decided to put his faith, weak and immature at that point as it was, in God. And it was a faith that did grow over the years, such that when he was 100 years old, he chose to believe God and wait for him to provide him with a son. I mean, Abraham eventually had the faith to see that only God could do those kinds of things. Paul says Abraham knew that at that point, when he was 100, his body was as good as dead. He was an old man with an old wife. No pharmaceutical company could help them start a nation. But Abraham didn't allow his life to be determined by what was possible with human power. He was completely dependent on God, God alone. Abraham, his father Terah, might have had a stronger faith, but you see, Terah had put his faith in the wrong gods. Abraham put his faith in the right God, the one true God. Yes, it was an immature faith in the beginning, a little faith at first, but that's the point here. You see, it was better for him to have a little faith in a big God than to have big faith in a little God. And that's good news for you and me. This is why Jesus says you only need faith the size of a mustard seed. Why? Because it's not about the size of your faith, it's about the size of your God. Pastor Tim Keller talks about the time when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt, escaping from the Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh was pursuing them with his chariots, and God parted the Red Sea, and the Israelites ran through on dry ground. There was a wall of water to their right and a wall of water to their left. Keller says some of these fleeing Hebrews probably loved what was going on at that point. They said things like, "In your face, Pharaoh, eat your heart out, we're cruising now." And no doubt as they ran, others said, "We're going to die, I'm going to die." Not all of the Hebrews expressed the same caliber of faith, but they were all equally saved, because it's not the quality of your faith that saves you. No, it's the object of your faith that saves you. And that's the good news of the gospel. This is why Paul said Abraham is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed. Romans 4. What God is that? Well, Paul goes on to say in the same verse, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that are not. I love this quote from James Dunn. He says, the character of Abraham's faith is determined by the character of the God in whom he believed. Abe's hope was not in how strong his faith was. His hope was in God. What God again? The God who raises the dead to life, the God who created everything from nothing, the God to whom all our problems, all those things that are causing us fear right now, including this mighty pandemic that we feel will never end, all those things to our God are less than a speck of fine dust on a pair of scales. Here's the second thing we can learn about walking by faith instead of sight from Abraham. We can learn that faith is obedience. Remember, Abraham's faith first showed up when he obeyed God and left Ur. After leaving Ur, must have been hard for him. As I said, it was a port city with a flourishing trade. The land had rich soil watered by those two rivers, soil that produced corn and date palms and apples and grapes and pomegranates and tamarisks. It was no small thing to leave a country like that and set off across the Arabian desert to an unknown land and presumably less desirable land. Yet this is what God told him to do, and he also told Abraham to leave his people. Again, I can't help but think of our Kathy. She left behind the security of friends and family and nieces and nephews to go to a new, unfamiliar place. But that's what God asked her to do. And like Abe, she had the faith to obey him and do that. Well, this is a very important principle of faith. For as it says in Hebrews 11:1, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Abraham showed his faith because he obeyed. He got off his couch in Ur and took action, even though he couldn't really see where he was going to end up. The questions were not all answered. He didn't know how everything was going to work out, but he knew what God had asked of him, and he obeyed. And let me remind you at this point that faith shows. Obeying God is a visible thing. As James 2:18 puts it, faith is something that's seen in what we do. Now, as you probably know, during this pandemic, when the virus was spreading through New York City like wildfire, Samaritan's Purse set up a field hospital right in the middle of Central Park. Well, Kathy sent us a video posted by a man who lives in a townhome that adjoins Central Park, which tells you he's a very wealthy man. Well, in the video, this man confessed that he is an atheist and that before the pandemic, he had all kinds of negative opinions about Christians. But he saw the faith of those volunteer nurses and doctors who came to ground zero of this plague to help people like him and his neighbors. And that moved him. It moved him to tears. Their obedience melted his heart toward believers like you and me. In fact, he got out of his town home and volunteered to help. He spent several days working to set up the hospital. One day, he even took his car and filled it literally top to bottom, spending thousands of his own dollars to buy food for the doctors and nurses to have on their breaks. Now, he hasn't put his faith in Jesus yet, at least I haven't heard that he has. But seeing the faith of those Christians moved this man to tears. He saw that their faith was real. I mean, they risked their lives to come and serve in this hot zone. I hope you'll pray with me that what he saw, what he witnessed, will lead him to open his heart to put his faith in Jesus. Okay, one more faith lesson and we're done. Remember, first thing we can learn is when it comes to faith, what's important is your object. And then the second thing we can learn is that faith is seen in our obedience. And then the third lesson Abraham's example can teach us is that faith is trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. As I said, Abraham's faith started small, but it grew, especially when their son Isaac was finally given to them. And both Sarah and Abraham learned in that delivery that God always has the last laugh. Well, in this and other experiences, Abraham discovered that nothing was impossible for God. He saw time and time again that God could make a way when there was no way. He learned to have faith in God's power and love. But Abraham's faith story wasn't over. You see, when Isaac was about 15 years old, just about the time he got his camel driver's license, I guess, God asked Abraham to do an impossible thing, something that did not make sense. He said very clearly, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, Abraham knew exactly what was being asked of him because remember I told you he was a native of Ur, a place where human sacrifice was practiced. So can you imagine what Abraham thought in that moment? I don't understand this, God. You just gave me this son finally in my old age, and now you want me to sacrifice him? That makes no sense. But even so, he obeyed, and so did Isaac, by the way. Remember, he was 15 at the time and could have very easily overpowered his 115-year-old. But they both obeyed. They trusted God, and true to God's character, he stopped Abraham in mid-thrust and said, don't do that, and then provided a lamb for the sacrifice instead. That's what heroic faith is like. It's believing even when it doesn't make sense. It's believing that even though we can't understand how, God is always working in all things for our good. You know, all those quarantine cruise ships we see on the news even now, well, they are all made out of steel. And you know, I was thinking, if you were to take a single part of that ship, that massive floating ship, like a steel plate out of its hull or the huge steel rudder, and if you were to take that part and throw it in the ocean, it would sink because steel does not float. Amen? Right, it doesn't float. So building a ship out of pieces of steel that doesn't float doesn't make sense. But you know, when the shipbuilders are finished, of course, when the last plate has been riveted into place, then that massive ship is virtually unsinkable. Doesn't make sense, unless you're a shipbuilder, I guess, but it works. Well, there are parts of our lives that don't make sense. It feels like our fears are going to sink us. It feels like our bank account or the lack thereof is going to sink us. It feels like we're going to get this disease and die, and that's going to sink us. But we have to trust God anyway. We have to believe that He's building something with these sinkable parts, something good, something unsinkable. We don't know how God is using this part of our lives or that part of our lives for our good and His glory, but we have to have faith that He is. I know that someday we're going to look back on this pandemic and we're going to thank God for all the good things that He has done for us through it all. Doesn't make sense now, but one day it will. I believe that. Now, if you're watching and you're like that guy in Central Park, I mean, you have not put your faith in Jesus yet, don't wait any longer. Today, right now, put your faith in Jesus. It's not complex. You just simply talk to God and admit to Him that you're a fallen being, that you do bad things and think bad thoughts like we all do, including me. You tell Him you've decided to believe that Jesus is His Son, that He died on that cross years and years and years ago for your fallenness, your sin, like He did. He did for all our sin. And then you just ask God to forgive you. And you tell Him that, like Abraham, you've decided you're going to follow Jesus, that wherever He leads, you'll go. If you're a Christian, well, this is a great day for us all to recommit ourselves to more faithfully following God, even in this difficult time. In fact, let's all do that by singing a familiar chorus. I know you know these words. Wherever He leads, I'll go. Wherever He leads, I'll go. I'll follow my Christ who loves me so. Wherever He leads, I'll go. Amen. Thank you. Now, this week in our devotions, the videos that our staff puts up Monday through Thursday, we're going to be looking at each day a lesson that can be learned by one of the great hymns of the faith. I know you've missed singing these 2 months, so tune in every day and get ready to sing an oldie but goldie, okay? Now, say it with me. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace. And let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. And this week, whatever you do, in word or in deed, do it all in the name of Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. Amen and amen.